In a world where money talks and loyalty is often forgotten, Tom was just an ordinary farmer fighting for what was rightfully his. But when developers came knocking, determined to take everything he had worked for, he knew his life would never be the same. Little did he know, one unexpected turn of events would change his fate overnight. Stay tuned as we uncover how a fight for land became a fight for something far greater. This is Tom's story. Let's dive in. The letter arrived at Tom Harris's door just before sunrise. It was cold and final, a letter that made his heart sink before he even opened it. For over 50 years, Tom had worked the land, planted crops, repaired fences, and helped pilots land their helicopters on his farm. But now, that land, the farm that had been in his family for generations, was being taken from him by developers. At first, Tom couldn't believe it. He had heard stories about land being sold for big developments, but he never thought it would happen to him. This wasn't just about losing crops or money. It was about losing his legacy. The farm wasn't just land. It was his father's, his grandfather's. It had been passed down through the generations, and now someone was coming to take it. That morning, as the letter sat on the kitchen table, Tom felt a deep anger and sadness rise up in him. How could this be happening? He'd worked so hard. He had spent his life on this land, living and breathing it. It was all he knew. And now, someone else was going to rip it away from him. But what came next was even harder to believe. The very next day, something strange happened. A Black Hawk helicopter appeared in the sky. The massive helicopter flew low, making a loud noise as it came closer. Tom stood frozen, unsure of what to do. This wasn't something you expected to see over a quiet farm. The helicopter circled, then slowly landed right on Tom's land, the very land he thought he had lost. It was bigger than anything he had ever seen. And then, men climbed out, dressed in uniforms, like they were here for something important. Tom had worked with local authorities before, but this felt different. These men weren't just regular police or workers. He didn't know who they were, but he knew they weren't here for anything good. As he watched them, Tom could feel his heart pounding. His farm, his home, his future. It was all slipping away. And soon, he would learn that this was just the beginning of a much bigger story, one that would change everything he thought he knew about power, control, and survival. Tom Harris was not just a farmer. He was the heart of the land, the keeper of a history passed down through generations. His grandfather had cleared the rugged land during the Great Depression, when food was scarce and the country was struggling. It was hard work, but the land had a way of rewarding those who stuck with it. When Tom's father took over, he built a thriving farm with a landing zone for helicopters, something that was unique in their small town. He'd always said it was important to help the young pilots. After all, they would one day be the ones flying to save lives. Growing up, Tom had learned to respect the land. It wasn't just soil and crops, it was a living, breathing thing. It gave you back what you put into it, and in return, it shaped who you were. His father taught him everything he knew, from planting seeds in the early spring to the satisfaction of watching them grow. He taught him that hard work was the only thing that mattered. There was no shortcut in life. You could build something lasting, something that would stand the test of time, but only if you were willing to give everything you had. When Tom was a young man, he left for a short while, like most young people do, to chase the world beyond his small town. He worked odd jobs, saw new places, and met new people. But every night, he found himself thinking of the farm. It was as though the land had a pull on him, a quiet whisper that he couldn't ignore. The day his father fell ill, Tom knew it was time to come home. Returning to the farm wasn't just a decision to help his father. It was a choice to preserve the family legacy. It was a decision to carry the torch and to honor the sacrifices made by those who came before him. The land had shaped Tom's life, and he knew that, one day, his children would grow up with the same connection. His dream had always been to pass down the farm, to see it grow stronger and more prosperous under his children's hands. He married Sarah, a local woman who understood the challenges of farm life. They had 2 children, Emma and Jake, both of whom had grown up with the same love for the land that Tom had. Sarah was the steady force in their lives, managing the home and making sure the family stayed grounded. She had always believed that the farm was a symbol of who they were: strong, humble, and connected to something greater than themselves. Tom and Sarah would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set behind the fields, and talk about the future. They dreamt of growing their family's history, of passing it on to the next generation. But now, that future seemed uncertain. The letter that arrived that morning was a cold reminder that everything Tom had worked for was at risk. It wasn't just about the crops or the land. It was about the life he had built. It was about his family's legacy being erased. As the developers came knocking, Tom realized that the world he had always known was changing. Sarah had stayed quiet, but Tom knew that she was just as worried. She had lived through the good times and the bad with him, and now she was watching as everything they had built started to slip away. Every corner of that land held memories for Tom. The old barn where he had worked alongside his father, the fields where they had shared a quiet meal after a long day's harvest, the landing zone where young pilots first learned to fly, and Tom had watched with pride, knowing he was helping shape the future. The farm wasn't just a piece of property. It was the story of his family. It was his story, and it was the story of everyone who had worked, loved, and lived there. Now, all that was being threatened. The developers didn't see the land the way Tom did. They didn't see the sweat, the history, the sacrifices. To them, it was just another piece of real estate to sell. But to Tom, it was his father's voice in the wind, his children's laughter in the fields, and his own heart beating with the rhythm of the land. It was everything. Every part of him resisted the idea of losing it. But Tom knew something deeper than just anger. He knew he couldn't let his family's history slip away without a fight. It was more than just a piece of property. It was a way of life, a tradition that had survived for generations. And that fight? It was one that Tom was ready to take on, no matter what it cost him. In his mind, the fight wasn't just about land. It was about preserving what made him who he was. His values, his dedication to his family, his loyalty to the land, and his belief in a better future for his children. Those were the things that drove him. And as the developers moved closer, Tom would stand firm. He had no choice but to fight. Because without the land, without this piece of his soul, Tom wasn't sure who he would be. The days after the letter arrived were a blur. Tom sat at the kitchen table, his hands trembling as he stared at the cold, impersonal words on the page. Each letter was another strike against everything he had built. Techscape Developers. The name sounded so harmless, so official. But Tom knew better. It was a giant, a corporation with no heart, swallowing up small towns like his in the name of progress. The offer they sent was, on paper, a dream. It was more money than Tom had ever seen, enough to give his children a future without the struggles of farm life. But could he really put a price on all that he had worked for? Could anyone understand what this farm meant to him? Tom had spent his whole life nurturing that land, building something that wasn't just his, but his family's. He could almost hear his father's voice in the back of his mind. It's not just the land, Tom. It's what you do with it. It's what you pass on. But how could he pass on something that was being taken from him? He stared at the papers, the offer from Techscape, and his heart ached. He had worked tirelessly to make the farm a success. He had made it a place where his children could play, where his father had taught him the ropes of farming, where every inch of earth held memories of sweat and sacrifice. Could money really replace that? Could the price of progress replace 50 years of history? The phone rang, and Tom picked it up, his thoughts still heavy. It was Sarah. "Tom, we need to talk," she said, her voice tight, as though she had been holding something in. "The offer. What are we going to do about it?" Tom leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He could hear the worry in her voice. Sarah had always been the calm one. She was practical. But this was more than she could handle alone. "I don't know," Tom said, his voice low. "I've been thinking about it. Maybe it's just what we need. Maybe we can finally get out of this. We wouldn't have to worry about the farm anymore, Sarah. The kids, Sarah interrupted. Are we just going to let them grow up without knowing what we've built here? What this place really means?" Tom exhaled sharply. Sarah didn't understand. She was afraid, just like him, but she was also afraid of what would happen if they didn't take the offer. They had been scraping by for so long, always living on the edge. There was a part of Tom that wondered if it was time to walk away, to stop fighting. Maybe the world had changed too much, and there was no place for a man like him anymore. But then he thought of Emma and Jake. He thought about the mornings he spent with them, teaching them how to plant seeds, how to respect the land. He thought about their laughter in the fields and the way they would run to him at the end of the day, covered in dirt, faces lit with excitement. Could he really take that away from them? Could he be the one to rob them of their future, their history? "Tom," Sarah said softly, pulling him from his thoughts. "You have to decide. Are you going to let them take this from us, or are you going to fight?" The weight of her words sank deep into Tom's chest. He had always been a fighter, but this fight felt different. It felt bigger. He wasn't just fighting for land anymore. He was fighting for his family, for the future of the people he loved most. He couldn't let Emma and Jake grow up in a world that didn't understand the value of what they had built together. The next morning, Tom drove to the local town hall to meet with the developers. He had heard rumors that Techscape had already bought up several properties around the area, but he had always refused to believe it. Now, he was face to face with their representatives. They were slick, polished, and didn't have a single wrinkle on their faces. The man in charge, Greg Mitchell, smiled at him with a charm that felt too practiced, too rehearsed. "Mr. Harris," Greg began, "we appreciate you meeting with us today. We understand this is a difficult decision for you, but the offer we're making is more than fair. I'm sure you can see that." Tom didn't respond immediately. He stared at the papers laid out on the table, trying to keep his anger in check. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. These people didn't care about his father's dream, or the countless hours he had spent working on the land. To them, it was just land to be sold. Another check to cash. Greg continued, "The money we're offering will allow you and your family to live comfortably for the rest of your lives. You won't have to worry about the farm anymore. Think of the possibilities. Think of what you could do with that kind of money." Tom felt his fists clench. He had heard it all before. The smooth words, the promises of an easier life. But the truth was, Tom wasn't sure what an easier life would even look like. This farm was all he knew. It was his home, his identity. He stood up, his chair scraping across the floor, and looked Greg straight in the eye. "You don't understand. This isn't just land. This is my life. This is my father's legacy. You can't just buy that. You can't just take it and walk away." Greg looked at him with a small, almost pitying smile. "I understand, Mr. Harris, but we both know this is the way things are going. Change is coming whether you like it or not. You can either be a part of it, or you can fight a losing battle." The words stung more than Tom cared to admit. He had always known this day might come, but now that it was here, It felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. As he walked out of that meeting, the weight of the decision hung over him. The fight was far from over, but it was beginning to feel like he was already losing. Tom had spent the days after his meeting with the developers, pacing the worn floors of the farmhouse, barely able to sit still. The weight of the decision gnawed at him, and every thought felt like a heavy stone pressing down on his chest. The offer was too good to pass up. They'd be set for life. But it was the price of his soul, wasn't it? The price of the land, the farm, his family's history. It felt like a part of him would die if he gave it up. He couldn't bring himself to sign the papers, but the pressure was mounting. Techscape was relentless. They were offering more money with every passing day, pushing harder, calling more often. They were circling, closing in, and Tom felt the walls slowly closing around him. He thought about Sarah, the stress written on her face, and Emma and Jake, who asked every night when they could go fishing again, their carefree voices full of hope. Could he really tell them that their world was about to be torn apart? Could he make them understand? Then came the night when everything changed. It was late, long after Sarah had gone to bed, and Tom was sitting on the porch with his feet propped up on the railing. The darkness of the night felt heavier than usual. The wind barely stirred, and the stillness pressed down on him, suffocating. He stared out at the land he had always known, his mind spinning with uncertainty. He had made peace with the fact that he might have to sell. Maybe this was the world moving on. Maybe he was just holding on to something that no longer had a place. That was when he heard it. The hum of helicopter blades cutting through the air. It was faint at first, but it grew louder until the sound was unmistakable. At first, Tom thought it was one of the helicopters that sometimes came in for practice landings. But this was different. This wasn't a training flight. The roar of the engines was too deep, too powerful, and it wasn't coming from the usual direction. It was headed straight for the farm. His heart raced. He stood up, eyes scanning the sky. And then, like a shadow in the night, a Black Hawk helicopter appeared over the tree line. It sliced through the quiet, its massive rotor blades sending gusts of wind down onto the land below. Tom froze, his mouth going dry. The helicopter was unlike any he had seen before. It wasn't military, but it was close enough. The helicopter descended slowly, its dark silhouette against the dimming sky. Tom took a step forward, his hands gripping the railing. Was it a sign? Had someone finally noticed? Was this his chance to fight back? The helicopter touched down in a clearing just a few hundred feet away from the house. The blades slowed to a stop, and the dust settled in the air. Tom stood there, his mind racing. Was it the military? Someone from the government? Or was it just another developer, using force to claim what was rightfully his? His heart hammered in his chest as he watched the door of the helicopter swing open. A figure in black tactical gear stepped out. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a confidence that made Tom's skin prickle. The stranger scanned the surroundings, his eyes locking on Tom. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to pause, the wind holding its breath. Then the man spoke, his voice low but clear. "Tom Harris?" Tom nodded, unable to speak. His heart was racing, but his mind was in a fog. "I'm Lieutenant Jack Foster," the man said, stepping forward. "I work with a group that's been keeping an eye on the developments happening in this area. I'm here to help." "Help?" Tom asked, confusion flooding his voice. "Help with what? What do you mean?" Lieutenant Foster's eyes were sharp as he scanned the land around them. "The developers you're dealing with? They're part of something bigger, something that goes all the way up. Techscape is pushing people like you out of their homes, tearing apart entire communities. But they've been under investigation for months now. You're not alone, Tom." The words hit Tom like a wave. He had known that Techscape was ruthless, but to hear that they were part of something far more sinister, it sent chills through his spine. He had been fighting this battle alone, or so he thought. But now, he wasn't just a farmer facing down developers. He was part of something bigger. Tom looked at the helicopter, then back at Lieutenant Foster. "What do you want from me?" The man's expression softened, but there was still a fire in his eyes. "We need your help. We need someone on the inside, someone who knows the land, someone who's lived through the slow destruction they've caused. You're fighting for more than just your farm now. You're fighting for your town, for all the people who are about to lose everything." The weight of the words settled in Tom's chest. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the entire community, their homes, their lives, everything they stood for. Lieutenant Foster stepped closer, his voice firm. "We've got your back, but you need to make a choice. If you want to fight, we'll be with you every step of the way." Tom stood there, a wave of emotions crashing over him. Anger, fear, relief, and disbelief all at once. The world had felt like it was closing in on him, but now there was a chance. There was a way to win. The decision was no longer just about saving his farm. It was about standing up against a system that had been taking advantage of people like him for far too long. Tom finally spoke, his voice steady but full of conviction. "I'll fight," he said, the words ringing out in the quiet night. "I'll fight for my land, I'll fight for my family, and I'll fight for this town." As the helicopter's engines roared back to life, Tom felt the first spark of hope in weeks. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like he had a chance. The months that followed Tom's decision were a blur of strategy meetings, phone calls, and tense nights spent looking over his shoulder. With Lieutenant Foster and the small group of allies who had rallied behind him, Tom fought back in ways he had never imagined. The developers, once so confident in their power, now found themselves up against a force they hadn't anticipated. A community united, a farmer unwilling to give up his legacy, and a team that wasn't afraid to fight dirty. It wasn't easy. The legal battles dragged on. The media spun the story in ways that left Tom frustrated, and Techscape used every trick in the book to apply pressure. More threats, more tactics to discredit him, and even veiled attempts to buy him off again. But through it all, Tom held strong, leaning on his community and the unexpected alliances that had formed in the wake of his stand. And then, the breakthrough came. After months of legal wrangling and media exposure, Techscape was forced to halt their development plans. Investigations into their shady business dealings had finally come to light, and the public outcry was too much for even their corporate clout to silence. The governor, who had been swayed by the story of the little farm in the middle of the fight, stepped in with a promise of reform, stricter controls on land acquisition, especially in rural communities like Tom's. The land was saved. As the victory settled in, there was a sense of relief, but it wasn't the triumphant, easy victory Tom had hoped for. The damage had already been done. Techscape's greed had left scars in the community. People who had once felt safe had been made to question the very foundation of their homes. Some had even sold out before the fight had reached its peak, unable to see the bigger picture or fight through the overwhelming pressure. But for Tom, the victory wasn't just about keeping the farm. It was about reclaiming the spirit of the place, something that could never be bought or sold. On the day they announced the victory, Tom stood on his porch, looking out at the land that had defined his life. Sarah stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. Emma and Jake were running around in the yard, playing as though nothing had ever changed, their laughter light in the air. But Tom knew that everything had changed. This wasn't just about a farm, or even a community. This was about standing firm, about making sure that the things that really mattered didn't get trampled on by greed. And even though things weren't perfect, and there would always be scars left from the battle they'd fought. Tom had learned something invaluable in those months of struggle. Some things are worth more than money. Some things can't be measured in profit margins or square footage or the size of a paycheck. Tom had stood up for what mattered: the land, the memories, the legacy. And in doing so, he'd rediscovered the very essence of what had driven his family for generations. It wasn't just about survival. It was about preserving the integrity of the life they had built. As the sun began to set that evening, casting a golden light over the farm, Tom watched as his children ran past him, their faces glowing with joy. He felt a peace settle over him that had been absent for far too long. He had done it, not just for himself, but for the next generation. "I was ready to lose everything," Tom thought, his voice quiet but resolute. "But what I gained, what I fought for, is so much more than I could have imagined." He knew there would always be more battles ahead. Life was never simple, and the world was constantly changing. But as long as he stood on this land, as long as he could pass down the lessons he had learned, Tom knew that there would be hope. Sometimes, the greatest victories aren't the ones where you win everything. Sometimes, it's about what you preserve: the values, the memories, the traditions that shape who we are. And as he looked out at his farm, Tom knew that his struggle had been worth it. It had been a fight for something bigger than himself, something that no developer could ever take away. He smiled as he turned to his family, feeling the weight of their history on his shoulders and a quiet pride in his heart. They had fought for this. They had fought for something that would never be measured in dollars. And in the end, that was a victory that would last forever. "You did good," Sarah whispered as she stood beside him. Tom nodded, his eyes soft with the weight of everything they had been through. "We did good." And as the last of the light faded over the horizon, Tom realized that, no matter what came next, he had already won the most important battle of his life. As Tom sat on the old wooden porch, the sounds of the farm around him felt like music to his ears. Birds chirping, the distant hum of the wind, and his children's laughter echoing in the air. The fight had been hard, and the road had been long, but now everything seemed to settle into a quiet peace. In that moment, he realized that his battle hadn't just been for the land. It had been about preserving something far more important. It was about preserving the heart of the community, the traditions that had been passed down through generations, and the unwavering commitment to family and hard work. Sometimes, the world tries to take it all from you, Tom thought, looking out at the fields. But if you stand your ground, if you hold on long enough, you'll find that some things are worth more than anything money can offer. The land would always be there, just as his family's legacy would always live on, no matter how much the world around them changed. And for Tom, that was the greatest victory of all. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he couldn't help but smile, knowing that he had done right by those who came before him, and by those who would come after. And that's how everything unfolded. What do you think? Was justice truly served? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more gripping stories, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload. See you in the next one.